To simplify things, we've identified three core dimensions that underpin all trusted decisions. First, the decisions have to be in context. One has to understand the strategy in order to be able to explain the best course of action. Secondly, it obviously has to be correct. We have to make sure that the decisions we make are consistent with the organization's strategy, direction, and requirements. And finally, they need to be connected. The decisions we make, we need to understand how they connect to all other functions and implications across the business. So let's step through these one at a time. Context. Context is about the decisions we make. Now, I'm going to use the example here of Southwest Airlines. The idea of Southwest as an example is great because airlines should compete and be basically identical. For goodness sake, they fly the same airplanes into the same airports with the same pilots and the same maintenance. Everything else should be identical, and therefore its performance should be as well. Yet some of these airlines perform order of magnitude better than others. If we take a look at that, we must be able to understand the underpinning strategy and how that drives different performance. Now, I'm not going to share with you any top secret information. The work that we did at Southwest has been published in over 32 books at this point in time. Now, the idea of Southwest is all about, to simplify things, we've identified three core dimensions that underpin all trusted decisions. First, the decisions have to be in context. One has to understand the strategy in order to be able to explain the best course of action. Secondly, it obviously has to be correct. We have to make sure that the decisions we make are consistent with the organization's strategy, direction, and requirements. And finally, they need to be connected. The decisions we make, we need to understand how they connect to all other functions and implications across the business. So let's step through these one at a time. Context. Context is about the decisions we make. Now, I'm going to use the example here of Southwest Airlines. The idea of Southwest as an example is great because airlines should compete and be basically identical. For goodness sake, they fly the same airplanes into the same airports with the same pilots and the same maintenance. Everything else should be identical, and therefore its performance should be as well. Yet some of these airlines perform order of magnitude better than others. If we take a look at that, we must be able to understand the underpinning strategy and how that drives different performance. Now, I'm not going to share with you any top secret information. The work that we did at Southwest has been published in over 32 books at this point in time. So, to help people relate to this better, we should be able to translate this strategy down to the processes and projects in which they work. So imagine taking that strategy map and listing your core processes next to it. We could begin to identify where each process supported each objective. So for example, if we ran process B, we'd see that we linked to this objective at 2%, this one at 5%, this one at 15, and this one at 2. So clearly this is the most important objective, and we better make darn sure our process supports that objective well. We also need to make sure that we work cross-functionally with these other three processes that also link to that same strategic objective. So this allows us to begin to translate strategy into action, understand how what we do contributes to the strategy. And obviously if the weighting changes, i.e. our strategy, on any objective, we can realign our processes to align closer to the new critical ones. Now, we can even take this a step further. Rather than a check mark, we can begin to put performance indicators next to each of these connection points and begin to put our process performance into strategic context. Now, as part of the Lean Six Sigma campaign, we can even give this a score to see how well each strategic objective is being supported by the current processes. So this strategic process capability analysis would look like this. Next to each objective, we can understand how well we're currently performing, in this example, the blue bar, and the gap between the current performance and how we need to perform to be successful, the gold bar. Now we can clearly see where the strategic weaknesses are in our process environment. If we had $1 to spend on process improvement, we should spend it on this objective because of the size of the gold bar, the process gap, compared to, say, this one. So again, as part of translating strategy into action, we can begin to work towards linking this to driver-based planning. How does that work? Well, Imagine we did the same activity and we rated and ranked the impact of our proposed process improvement initiatives for this year against those same strategic objectives. If we took a look at just those gold bars, the process gaps that we're trying to close, we can actually take each of those projects, represented here by the red dots, and chart the gap closing potential of each of those initiatives. Inevitably, we see something like this, where we have two gold bars about the same height. The process gap for this objective and this one are about the same. Yet, not many of the projects focus on improving this objective, retain talent, and we have a lot of projects associated with optimized service delivery. Now, we're not saying this is a hard equation, but what we are doing is making an intangible asset conversation tangible, visible, so we can all have a conversation about how well our investments are helping close those potential gaps. So the second part about trusted decision making is it has to be correct. Now, as silly as this sounds, often we're not looking at complete or correct data or complete or correct assumptions, and therefore we make decisions which inherently take us away from our goals, not closer. Let's take a look at this. One of the clients we're working with had a question about how do they understand how they're performing around a transcontinental client. So sales are done regionally and nationally, but this customer is looking at them globally and seeing discrepancies in prices, quality, shipments, and so forth. And if they try to answer that question, they take a look at their internal processes, we find that information has to go to a number of completely different systems and different units of measures, customer identifiers, and so forth. So, in this example, field sales service eventually has to go to PSO. From them, they have to have a conversation with the individual market channel partners. From them, they have to go to major accounts, which of course Dell would be. From there, they go back to some sort of transaction processing. Manufacturing then can answer some of those questions. It goes back to logistics. From there, it goes back to major accounts and eventually into the customer support desk. The issue is this. This question had to go through a number of significant systems. Each of those systems are obviously independent. They have different closing times. They have different even identifiers for the same customer, the same part, the same SKU number, all seem to have different identifiers and different ways of referring to each other. And so it's impossible to unravel that and understand what is the actual data against which I'm trying to make a decision. So what we should be able to do to solve that problem is take a look at it back in the context of strategy. See, whenever we have discrepancy at a detail level, the simple approach is go to a more aggregate level until I can get overall agreement. So now I could take a look at those core processes, and instead of looking at the transactional level, put next to each of the core processes simple indicators on each of how that aggregate performance is performing. Now, in theory, for this objective of, say, customer intimacy, these processes plus these projects will lead to overall success. Now, typically when we think of mathematics, the input should be on the left. So if we change the order of these things around, in theory, we should be able to present a report to management that says if we can get these processes and these projects working correctly, we'll achieve this objective, in this example of customer intimacy. And we just need a way to make this available to the entire organization. Now I can begin to make decisions based on correct data because I've aggregated it to the level where I know I have some degree of accuracy. Now, this seems a bit silly, but let's stop for a second and think about how management works. What management wants to be able to do, metaphorically, is fly at 30,000 feet and see a big picture of how the organization works. Instead, we take this aggregate data and we end up building detailed dashboards and hope that they can understand at the transactional level what's happening at the strategic level. It'd be smarter for us to take our data and provide a 30,000-foot view of the organization. Get a snapshot of the organization that's a strategic snapshot so leadership can begin to prioritize where they focus their time. Looking outside the jet window, they can see a broad expanse of the horizon and see several plumes of smoke coming up from broken processes and activities, and they need to prioritize which of those fires they should focus in on. Metaphorically, they then want to go down to 20,000 feet to gain an operational understanding of what's going on so they can begin to organize their thoughts about what strategy and techniques and tactics we might want to use to solve them. Based on that data, we then need to take them down to, say, 10,000 feet and provide them with a diagnostic tool so they can become more directional in their behavior. And finally, some analytic tools at ground level so they can become prescriptive. So let's take a look at these best practices around correct data to put them into context. In theory, the top of the house strategy view comes through a balanced scorecard. That gives us that 30,000 foot wide horizon view. The second level, that 20,000 foot, should come through an impact diagram where we can drill into all of those activities and begin to get a aggregate understanding of how each of those processes or projects are performing. Again, these are performance indicators, no different than the indicator light on the dashboard of your car that says check engine. You might not know all the mechanisms behind it, but it's enough that you as the driver can put that into context. The next level down is what we give to the astronauts inside the organization that understand the detailed process activity. It takes each of those aggregate indicators we saw in the impact diagram and takes it down to a daily or moment to moment, as near real time as necessary to run the business data. And then from there, we may drill down to the business intelligence layer where we can see the very specific data. So the idea is, as the data goes from the top of the house to the bottom, a couple of things happen. One is it gets more complex. Two, the timeline gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And three, you have to become more of a process expert to interpret it. Now, at the top of the house, the strategy map, as we saw before, might get cascaded down by region or by brand or by function. The impact diagram can be shown in a number of different ways. The part that is most fascinating to us these days are dashboards. There's so much that we're learning about how to provide compressed amounts of data into small sheets. The dashboards that we're showing here represent 20 or 30 pages of spreadsheet information aggregated into one simple dashboard that almost any process expert can understand. And then finally, of course, you have the BI layer. Again, that top of the house layer is the overall strategy layer. Drills down to an operational layer, a diagnostic layer, and an analytic layer. Chances are in your organization you have parts of this existing already. The trick is to join these together into one connected, integrated system.